Look closely at the foundations of Europe, from the Coburg Moor in Germany to the bridges of Venice and the royal heraldry of the Vatican. You see a face that, according to mainstream history, shouldn't be there. We are taught a singular, linear story, that the presence of the black man in the West began in 1619 in chains, stripped of a name, and devoid of a history before the plantation. But these monuments offer a silent, stone-cold rebuttal. If the only role of the black man in the West was that of the enslaved laborer, why are their faces cast in gold on the crests of noble families? Why are they depicted with crowns, pearls, and the armor of knights on the very buildings that house European law and commerce? You don't build monuments to a people you've only ever known as property. These aren't just decorations, they are receipts. They are the heraldic signatures of a population that held status, land, and lineage long before the first ship ever sailed for the Americas. This brings us to the great surname myth. We've been told our last names were given to us from the master, a branding of ownership. But when you look at the land registries of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, you find these same Moorish icons tied to the very surnames many of us carry today. What if the name wasn't given to you on a plantation, but brought with you from a lost heritage? What if the slave master didn't give you his name, but instead, he carries a name that his fathers assumed from earlier black populations in Europe? To understand how a Hunnite in European stone became a slave in American history, we have to look at how the definition of white was manufactured. Even the founders of America saw it differently. As Benjamin Franklin famously noted in 1751, the people we call European today weren't always seen as white. In fact, according to him, most of the continent, including the Germans, were what he called swarthy. If Franklin described the Germans of the mid-1700s as swarthy, we have to ask, who were the thousands of German men actually arriving on American shores just 25 years later? Enter King George III. History remembers him as the British monarch who lost the colonies, but his roots were German, the House of Hanover. When he needed to crush the American rebellion, he didn't just send British redcoats. He turned to his own ancestral lands and rented an army of over 30,000 professional soldiers. We know them as the Hessians. These weren't just random mercenaries. They were highly disciplined elite forces from Hesse Castle and other German principalities, the very same regions where we still find the Moorhead iconography on city gates and cathedral walls. And as Benjamin Franklin noted in his own writings, the demographics of that era were not what we are told today. This entire perspective, from the Hessians to the Boston Massacre, is a deep dive into the primary records highlighted in Lee Cummings' The Negro Question series. I've put the links to those books in the description if you want to follow the paper trail yourself. History is written by the victors, but the truth is hidden in the eyes of the survivors. Imagine it's the morning of October 15th, 1781. The smoke of the most pivotal battle of the American Revolution is clearing. A German private named Georg Daniel Flohr walks among the fallen at Redoubt 9. What he sees isn't the white war you were taught in school. For over a century, Flohr's eyewitness account remained a ghost. His 250-page manuscript sat undiscovered in the city library of Strasbourg, France, only being found and brought to light 100 years after it was written. It survived the passage of time to give us a bottom-up view that the official records tried to erase. In this lost diary, Flohr records a very large number of deceased soldiers, but he uses a specific, unmistakable word, Morin. In 18th century German, the word Morin, the plural of Moor, was the standard term for black people. How did they get there? To understand that, we have to look at the man sitting on the British throne. The narrative claims the American Revolution was a fight against English tyranny, but the primary sources reveal a British throne occupied by a purely German bloodline, the House of Hanover. King George III wasn't just a king of England, he was a German duke and prince elector of the Holy Roman Empire. But there is a detail the history books often omit: the physical descriptions of the king and his queen. George III was frequently described by contemporaries with terms that signaled a swarthy or dark complexion phenotype common to certain lines of the German and Portuguese aristocracy. This wasn't an English court, it was a continental court with deep roots in the Mediterranean and the Rhineland. To see the full picture, we have to look at Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. While she was a German princess, her primary records and portraits, specifically those by the royal painter Allan Ramsay, point to a very specific ancestry. The Portuguese connection. Research into Charlotte's genealogy reveals she was directly descended from a branch of the Portuguese royal house, specifically tracing back to Madragana ben Alejandro, a Moorish woman who was the mistress of King Alfonso III of Portugal. The mulatto description. Upon her arrival in England, the king's own physician, Baron Stockmar, described her as having a true mulatto face. Other contemporaries noted her swarthy complexion and broad nostrils, features that were explicitly captured in Ramsay's portraits but often softened or whitened by other court painters to fit a more traditional European narrative. This isn't just about royal gossip, it's about demographics. If the king and queen of the British Empire were themselves part of this swarthy German Moorish lineage, it explains the primary source reality of the soldiers they sent to the colonies. The Royal Dupont. When Georg Daniel Flohr looked at the dead Morin, black people, on the Yorktown battlefield, he was looking at the ethnic reality of the German states, the Linkhorn migration. When swarthy German Quakers like the Linkhorns moved into Pennsylvania, they weren't anomalies. They were part of a massive migration of dark-complexioned Europeans who were moving through the same networks as the king's own family. History tells a story of a revolution fought in black and white, but if you look closer at the ink and parchment of the era, a much more swarthy reality begins to emerge. In Paul Revere's iconic engraving of the Boston Massacre, we find a visual entry point into a European timeline that mainstream history has spent centuries obscuring. By analyzing the physical depiction of these figures, we see a direct, undeniable continuity with what witnesses like Georg Daniel Flohr observed on the bloody battlefields of Yorktown. While the modern narrative presents the British soldiers who are really Hessian soldiers and the Boston crowd as a monolithic white group, the engraving itself, particularly in its hand-colored versions, reveals a startling diversity of complexions. Several of the British redcoats are depicted not with the pale skin of the popular imagination, but with dark, swarthy tone complexions that contrast sharply with the powdered wig stereotypes of the 18th century. This wasn't an artistic fluke. It was a reflection of a colonial working class and a military force that was deeply, ethnically mixed. Even the martyrs of that night were subject to this shifting visual identity. Historically, the central figure of the massacre, Crispus Attucks, was of mixed so-called African and indigenous descent. Yet, in Revere's political imagery, he is often visually whitened to suit the specific racial narrative required by the burgeoning American cause. This swarthy appearance of the soldiers in 1770 provides the visual proof for what the German soldier Georg Daniel Flohr would record in his diary just 11 years later. On the morning after the storming of Redoubt 9 at Yorktown, Flohr looked upon a very large number of dead soldiers. He didn't describe them in nationalistic terms. He identified them specifically as Morin, the German term for Moors. This supports a black European timeline, suggesting that the British and German regiments were not strictly white, but included the same Moorish phenotypes that Flohr found significant enough to record. We see this same ethnic reality echoed in the Linkhorn family, the ancestors of Abraham Lincoln, and the German Redemptioners, who were consistently described in primary records as having dark complexions and coarse black hair. This hidden history explains how someone like Salome Muller, as discussed in our previous video, could be so easily swallowed by the slave system decades later. Salome was a German woman, yet her black hair and olive skin, the exact phenotype of the Moorish Europeans of the Revolution, allowed the legal system to label her a yellow girl, because the narrative had already decided that swarthy meant property. Her pure German parentage was ignored. Just as Flohr's diary was lost for over a century, the swarthy reality of the men who stood in the King Street was buried under a sanitized version of the past. To look at Revere's engraving today is to reclaim the evidence of a world that was far more diverse than the history books dare to admit. A primary source book that has multiple descriptions of Abraham Lincoln is The Story Life of Lincoln, at the bottom of page 332 through 333. If any personal description of me is thought desirable, it may be said I am, in height, 6 feet 4 inches nearly, lean in flesh, weighing, on an average, 180 pounds, dark complexion with coarse black hair and gray eyes. No other marks or brands recollected. On page 310, we have the following. This is the testimony of one who was present on that historic occasion. When Lincoln rose to speak, I was greatly disappointed. He was tall, oh how tall, and so angular and awkward that I had, for an instant, a feeling of pity for so ungainly a man. His clothes were black and ill-fitting, badly wrinkled, as if they had been jammed carelessly into a small trunk. His bushy head, with stiff black hair thrown back, was balanced on a long and lean head, stalk, and when he raised his hands in an opening gesture, I noticed that they were very large. He began in a low tone of voice, as if he were used to speaking outdoors and was afraid of speaking too loud. He said, "Mr. Chairman," instead of "Mr. Chairman," and employed many other words with an old-fashioned pronunciation. When we look at these primary sources, a striking pattern emerges. The Abraham Lincoln described by his own hand and by those who stood inches from him looks very little like the man portrayed in mainstream narratives today. While history books and monuments often present us with a polished, fair-complexioned figure with manageable hair, the eyewitnesses tell a different story. They describe a man with a dark complexion and coarse, bushy black hair that stood in defiant, stiff angles. In the transition from a living man to a marble icon, his skin was lightened and his features were softened to fit a more traditional aesthetic of the era. It is a reminder that the physical art we see today often reflects the biases of the artist rather than the reality of the man. To find the real Lincoln, the lean, dark, and ungainly figure of the frontier, we have to look past the monuments and back into the ink of the original records. For more deep dives into the history they didn't want to keep in the final edit, join us on our Substack where we challenge the mainstream narrative one primary source at a time.